We're sitting here, Alex Goldman, Copenhagen, welcome.
Thank you.
I think there's a lot of people watching this that are familiar with who you are, and there might be a few that doesn't know Alex. So let's start with who's Alex Goldman and why in Copenhagen?
Sure. So I am a futurist. I work at the Institute for the Future, which is a nonprofit think tank and research group based in Palo Alto. And we help, we're like 50 years old. It's a big, famous, important place. And we help organizations, governments, foundations, companies, global governments understand the future and understand changing disruptions and new technologies and cultural practices and how to strategize around that.
Okay. So your main job in the Institute for the Future, what is that? What do you do?
So I do a lot of research. So what that means is at any given point in time, I'm working on roughly five different projects. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those are longer term projects, 3-month, 4-month long projects that involve creating a research report of some kind around, what does the future of insurance look like, or the future of banking, or the future of refrigerated transportation, and it takes so many different roads. So that core research is a big part of it. Recently, we've also created a media lab. So I do a lot of work with the media lab as well, where I'll create virtual reality experiences because I actually have 2 master's degrees in game design. So that's a lot of what I do. And then I also run a lot of workshops and do a lot of presentations and meetings, and largely strategy sessions as well to try to help businesses and governments understand what are the changes that they're actually facing kind of beyond the hype. And how does today become 5 years from now, both from how does the world change, but also from the perspective of how do you, as an organization, develop strategies in a lean way that allow you to learn and allow you to progress.
Okay. Yeah. So in all of your work and the work in the Institute for the Future, what is on top of the agenda right now regarding the questions you're going to get and what you focus on in your work? What do you see out there?
Yeah, so every year we take a few specific areas of research that are kind of the giant umbrella areas that we tend to weave into a lot of our research. This past year it was the future of automation. So specifically looking at artificial intelligence and neural networks and machine learning. But largely from the perspective of human-machine symbiosis, so trying to understand, not how will machines replace humans, which is kind of a frivolous discussion, but how will human beings continue to use machines and new kinds of machines, and what will that dynamic look like? And but also at the same time, how does automation allow new forms of management and the division of tasks, and the use of labor platforms like Upwork or Elance or Odesk or anything like that to inform the new structure of an organization.
So basically, if we put a topic on that, it's like the future of work.
So it's a few different things. It's also, automation also impacts much more than work. It impacts how cities work, and it impacts how logistics function. It impacts how we think about education. So, and it also impacts the way we develop skills. So if you think, obviously none of us memorize the multiplication tables of 1,000 times whatever, right? But at the same time, a computer and a calculator both used to be terms for human jobs. So at the Institute, we also really focus on the historical context of all of these changes to understand how much of them are simply in keeping with the way things have happened throughout human history, and how many of them are transformative.
So what kind of questions do you get from your clients or the people that you work with? What are they puzzled about?
The average one, the one that we always get is this wave of disruption quantitatively and qualitatively different than the past ones? And is it good or evil? And those are important questions. But I really think they point at the bigger question, and one thing that's really resonated with me is that the fundamentally most important thing is cultural values and institutional values and organizational values. If you look at the
the far possible future possibilities for a world with huge amounts of automation. Either you have huge amounts of income inequality and you have this kind of dystopian society, or you have a world where people don't need to work. And if both are possible, then where is the decision making happen? One thing that the Institute does as well that I think a lot of other organizations don't is we look at the human factors. So we look at things, for instance, like, revolutions and cultural uprisings and political upheaval. Historically, how have those factored in and to like different threshold levels of unemployment for different age demographics? So for instance, the French Revolution was right before it, there was a huge spike in youth unemployment. So we try to put everything in context because that's when things become useful.
I think that's a valid point, because when you think about the people that talk about the future, they talk about the future and forget the past. So what can we actually learn from the past regarding the future? I think that's a valid point. And what might that be? What can we learn from the French Revolution or whatever in our future? What do you see there that is important for us to think about?
So we say it's important to look twice as far back as you look forward, but I usually say it's important to look about 100 times as far back as you look forward. To understand how this moment in time is a transitional moment, but so has every moment in the past, right? Like we imagine, okay, yes, there have been different rounds of automation, but the way our society works, we assume that this new wave of, for instance, I work with a ton of insurance companies and banks, right? And they think, okay, well, this is going to be disruptive for the way banks work. Well, or insurance companies work. That's actually not the right framing. Like if you look at the history of these different industries, the way they are now is almost like, a lot of insects go through like multiple metamorphoses, right? And they have a larva and a pupae phase and like all of these different phases. And these organizations, these industries are just in one of those transitional phases. So I think the most important thing, it's a skill that I call vision, which is the practice of identifying how arbitrary where we is right now, but at the same time accepting that the nature of our organizations is a reflection of technologies and historical values and prevailing mindsets and expectations. And then when you extrapolate that forward, it's really useful for imagining, okay, well, what are the universal and unchanging human values, and how are we disregarding those from our conversations? Things like our need for purpose and our desire for consistency and our need for a sense of belonging. So I think it's really important for everyone to study history extensively, particularly the history of their industry. And also political values are very different. So the same trends play out in different countries in a really important way.
I think that's a very good point. So you actually advise and to your clients saying, well, yes, emerging technologies are coming, etc., but don't forget the people game or the value game or the purpose game, or try to connect these. I think that's a good point.
And also, there's no such thing, I'd like to say, there's no such thing as 10 years from now.
No.
There's only today and tomorrow and the day after. And the significance of that is that institutions change it's not only a slow way, but it's, any change. So, there's this argument, I forget what it is, that creationists make. It's called irreducible complexity, I think.
Irreducible complexity.
Yeah, it's the notion that we couldn't have evolved eyes because essentially any phase before having eyes wouldn't have been useful evolutionarily, but that's not really the case. So it's useful to keep that in mind when thinking about organizations as well. So you think about like IBM's Watson and the implications and the opportunity for automating a way of like cancer diagnoses or other, really important medical approaches. But whatever comes after what we have now will integrate some aspect of that, but has to function within the legal and the organizational bounds of a hospital, for instance. And there's so many important regulatory and policy things, and if this technology could have replaced all doctors, 2 months from ago or from now, it would still take 20 years for that to happen.
Good point.
For a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So if I run a business now, you mentioned insurance, banking, etc.
Yeah.
With this environment, technology-wise, etc., as you are quite familiar with, what should I actually do, or what should I start doing right now? What should my mindset be right now regarding all these changes going on?
So I think there's at least 2 or 3 primary preoccupations that we should have. So the Institute offers a course on futurist thinking, which is really to help organize. We say it's like the skill beyond design thinking. So it's a course that we offer that helps organizations think about the future in a useful way.
Okay.
Because a lot of what that is sense making, trying to understand emerging things in a modular and flexible way. The one skill that we talk about a lot is signaling, which is the process of every week or every day devoting half an hour to an hour to looking through the news and identifying snapshots or snippets of what startups are doing or what other organizations are doing that indicate some potential direction of change.
So a daily habit.
I think it's important to both integrate daily habits, monthly habits, and kind of longer term strategy things.
Great, cool, yeah.
So that's a good daily habit. From like a shorter term weekly thing, I think it's important to, whenever you're in any meeting, to think about, are we painting ourselves in a corner here? Or to what degree can whatever initiative that we're working on now come to integrate new technologies? And then a longer term thing is, I work with a ton of organizations that have like annual planning meetings or planning meetings once every couple of years. So from that perspective, a lot of organizations need to restructure because having a planning session once a year is just, it's like, imagine you're driving on a road and only once a year do you decide what are the series of turns you should take, regardless of traffic patterns,
It's
right?
a scary image, right?
Yeah, and at the same time, new roads are coming up on the map and old roads are disintegrating into the ocean.
Sure.
And you've spent like $1.5 billion and you're like, yeah, we came up with this plan 2 years ago. So yeah, we're gonna take a right even though the bridge is down, Yeah.
So as a business owner, or as a big company or medium company or whatever company, how do I get more fit for the future?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there's the daily skills.
Daily skills, yeah.
There's the longer term strategic planning. Yeah. And then there's also, you could call them work habits or not mindsets. They're beyond daily practices, but they're more strategic skills. So I think there's a new kind of MPA that we need to develop that is organized around business savvy in a world where the foundations of business, they're not changing. You could say that they are changing, but it's not that they're all gone today and it's a new set tomorrow. Sure. We'll constantly have a free market. It's just the nature of the opportunities present in it will change. Yeah. The nature of commodification and commoditization and what services you can create value out of and which become a liability rather than an asset are changing. So there's that like skill set as well. And then I think the last thing is kind of the obvious, which a lot of people practice, but it's or a lot of people preach, but it's harder to practice, which is thinking about, how do you test new initiatives? And business leaders tend to think that a new initiative, whatever you test, you need like $30,000 or whatever, like 200,000 kroner to like, how are we going to test this? Yeah. But I really think that literally every single thing that you can test that is worthwhile, you can test for free in a day, the very first granular step of it. And I think the real strategy and the real thing we need to practice is not design thinking so much as integrating design thinking in a way of imagining the future of our business that has much more granular, smaller steps that help us get where we're going.
Okay, yeah. So from my perspective, I think that, or you can challenge that, is how is decision making being influenced by what you're saying?
Right.
The way we decide our road or our business decisions on a daily basis, that must be affected, right? That's what you're talking about. So what's changing there?
So traditionally, a lot of what I do is look at the way organizations promote and think about leadership and the nature of leadership. Yeah. And historically, it's been linked to expertise and authority, inarguable authority.
Yes.
An example of that is in a lot of institutions, the people who get promoted up to the top have worked at every level of the organization. Yeah. And therefore, they're so intimately familiar with how they all work. They're the expert on the organization as a whole, sure. Which becomes a liability, obviously, in times of change. And also, they tend to feel like they're the guardians of knowledge. So they're the ones, in other words, like they, imagine they're sitting inside a treasury, and their knowledge are coins, and they keep it all. And they feel like if they dispense that to other people or feel like other people are knowledgeable, then they're essentially giving away the bank. Versus in an emerging world, in a changing world, expertise and leadership and decision making has to be more about identifying opportunities. Being one of our distinguished fellows, Bob Johansson, says, you have to be very steadfast. I'm paraphrasing because I can never remember his exact. But you have to be very steadfast in where you're going, but very flexible in how you get there. And I think that's very accurate.
So dual or both and.
Yeah. And most importantly, I mentioned like missions and corporate values before. Mm-hmm. It can seem hokey to say that, but if you think about, why does your company exist? Yeah, sure. Like, do you exist to help alleviate people's suffering around the uncertainty of the future? Mm-hmm. Well, if that's the case and you're an insurance company, there are dozens of new opportunities, dozens of new markets, and dozens of new ways you can frame your product. Mm-hmm. Now, if you don't have that mission statement, you don't have something to fall back on, mm-hmm. and you think, oh yeah, we're just an insurance company, then suddenly you're shooting yourself in the foot,
And how do you experience that when you talk to companies and meet companies? Yeah. How connected are they to that purpose discussion or purpose framing?
Well, another interesting thing is, obviously, if you work at a business, your effort is devoted to daily work, right? So it's very hard to take a big step back and see what your vision is, what you want to accomplish, even for executives who oftentimes are dragged in the weeds.
Agreed. Yeah.
So a lot of what we offer in our workshops is the opportunity to do that re-identification and a realignment with an organization's vision from the perspective of helping, that being the first step toward understanding the future and their role in it. And the other thing is a lot of organizations, they just historically haven't had to cognitively process their values, And it becomes a mantra or a catchphrase in almost like a cartoonish way. Because, essentially, if things are working out, then you don't have to revisit where you've been.
I think that's part of the equation, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of businesses saying, well, it's going fine. We're making money right now.
Right.
You meet that as well? Saying,
totally.
So why change?
Totally.
I see all this, but why should we change? Because the Excel spreadsheet looks fine.
Yeah. Well, there's both an inertia and a momentum to change. Yeah. So inertia is the difficulty to get something moving, and momentum is the difficulty to stop something, right? And things might be working. There's the shallow answer is that things might be working well today, but they won't in the future. And it's important to practice the broader business skills that you need to thrive in the future, regardless of the current business climate. The other thing is that a lot of the skills that we teach and a lot of the sense making that we help organizations practice has much more to do with, it's much more than just the future, right? Like the changes we tend to talk about are transformative changes, but also, there are business cycles, right? And there will be another recession, and the strategies that businesses rely on for the next recession will be different from the past recession. Sure. And just another quote is, imagination is much more important than intelligence. That's paraphrasing Einstein.
There you are.
Yeah, but I've always felt that to be true. Yeah. And a lot of organizations, they just rely too much on intelligence because intelligence is the capacity to process a narrow batch of data in an optimal way. And imagination, to me, is the capacity to select between a much wider variety of data, right? And to decide what prioritization and to really reimagine things.
I think it's a good point. I don't think I have seen a company, especially not here in Denmark, where imagination were part of the core competencies.
Right.
They selected from and trained.
Right.
That must be more important going forward, right?
Yeah, and I think that's another part of the general equation. Is a ton of the work that I do is with HR departments, both on the future of work and the future of different business lines, different industries, right? And because I've found personally that the internal culture and the expectations of workers when they enter a business or a government or whatever institution generally shape the capacities of it to respond to change. Not in a hugely negative way, but in a noticeable way. So for instance, there are a lot of big companies where people apply to the company because they want very stable work. And innovation and change work can be stable, but you need a supplementary mindset and a supplementary goal, which has to do with becoming part of a much bigger thing. And in many ways, it's kind of an egotistical ideal because you have to feel like you have the capacity to have an impact on organizations. And a lot of companies do not hire for that. And a lot of companies actually punish applicants or punish existing employees.
In what way?
In the sense that, the way we evaluate employees, especially lower in an organization, tends to be on, obviously performance metrics and things like that. And there's a contradictory intention behind trying to promote for creativity and also promoting for accomplishing only key performance metrics.
Delivering,
And I think so much of change and succeeding in a world of change has to do with finding the middle road. And I think this is another example where the workforce that we should be promoting and cultivating, we should encourage them both to understand the importance of operational daily operations, which is hitting those performance metrics, but also cultivate like weekly discussions with management and bosses to think about, how do you actually surface good ideas? Because otherwise you're basically, throwing out the good eggs, and that can be seen a lot in a lot of the organizations that I have workshops or meetings with. They have found that people who were previously not necessarily ostracized, but people who were always outsiders in some other department became kind of like key players because they always had this outsider's perspective, which is really important. And also, if you have an innovation department itself, I found what's most successful is to have kind of a 50-50 blend of outsiders and people entirely from outside the industry and people from within the company who understand how things work, but
50-50?
Yeah.
That's quite a high number,
Yeah, because it's important to understand, imagine you have someone who's following a road or who needs to get from point A to point B. And they're trying to find a way to get there faster, right? The best combination of people is people who know all of the routes between point A and point B and creative people, right? Because imagine you have a hang, this is a weird metaphor, but imagine you have a hang glider, right? But you've never been on this route before. Okay, it's creative to use a hang glider, but you need to get on top of something high and then find somewhere safe to land, right? So you need to know the landscape very intimately, and you also need to think outside the box. And sometimes those can be the same people, but yeah.
So you're saying, if I'm an HR director, or as you mentioned, you work a lot with HR, what should I actually consider, or maybe even do even more going forward regarding people? The people I get on the bus and how I actually use them while they are on the bus. What should I do?
So I think most importantly is that they have a T-shaped talent set, which is to go beyond the cliche, but to start there first. T-shaped is someone with a deep area of expertise in a broad area of interest. I also think it's really important to identify employees who are motivated to learn on their own. And if you look at the value add opportunities, you want to find employees who are eager to not dig themselves into a corner, to not say, this is what I do, this is what you pay me for, this is what I'll always do at this company. But people who are eager to, and who have the faith and the belief in themselves that their nature within the organization might change over time, but that it'll be a constant pivoting, meaning that imagine you have an expertise with, actuarial practice, right? Like understanding the pricing of risk. if you're an HR director, you want to hire someone who has that understanding, but also understands that this is a really connected world.
Yeah.
And that the way we do this thing will change in the future. So you want someone who's eager to learn new skills, very disciplined, very enthusiastic, and very positive and optimistic. Yeah. Not to the point of ignorance, but to the point of having a sense of optimism. Not blind optimism, though.
Cool. Okay. You talked about gaming in the beginning.
Yeah.
You know a lot about gaming.
Maybe.
Yeah, I think so. So how do you see gaming as a potential? Yeah. In society, in business, in corporations?
Gamification is my least favorite word in the dictionary. Yeah. I'm trying to think of a single word that I dislike more. Because it never works. Yeah. The only way it works is if you provide people metrics for what they're accomplishing with regards to what they already want to accomplish. Uh-huh. So for instance, imagine you are a runner and you're trying to practice for a marathon. Sure. Gamification could be a useful tool for measuring and rewarding you based on the things you already want to accomplish. Yeah. If you use it as a metric or a wrapper around something that a person doesn't already care about, it becomes almost this frivolous, Kafka-esque, grossness, because essentially it becomes almost manipulative psychologically, and people are very attuned to that. So say for instance, you work at an insurance company, and I use insurance companies because they're such easy examples, and you're trying to roll out this gamification tool to help incentivize people to register the most policies or what have you, right? Now, if there's some financial reward for registering the most new policies, then gamifying it doesn't change anything. No. If your only reward for registering the most new policies is something insignificant and not related to financial reimbursement or promotion, then you're essentially saying that you should be motivated by banana stickers. And that doesn't work past kindergarten for a reason, right?
That's a potential.
Yeah. But at the same time, I think it's really important to identify that different things motivate all people, and that you can use, not gamification, but you can use behavioral design to engineer environments in which you are helping employees cultivate what they want to cultivate, and also identifying new work opportunities. So one opportunity is to use gamification outside of the context of daily practice for employees, and instead to think about gamification as you could have a day-long or 3-day strategy or company visioning experience. And part of that might involve exploring new career growth opportunities for your employees and helping measure their performance on certain metrics. The capacity for measurement and then providing feedback on that could help them understand where they want to go professionally. Within the broader business landscape outside of employees themselves, I think we're moving from a world of companies and consumers to companies, community, and consumers. Yeah. So company is anybody who works inside the company, consumer is anybody outside, and you just have a wall, right? The new space of community can include everything from platform workers on things like Uber and Airbnb to participants in crowdfunding or crowdsourcing, to contractors on new labor platforms like Upwork, to a friend of mine works at a makeup company, and a lot of the marketing they do is with these YouTube personalities, right? Yeah, sure. So this new space of community, I think, is a very poorly defined space, which is good. It shouldn't be well defined because then it would be concrete.
It's a new intersection between the traditional.
Yeah. And I think gamification could be used to help incentivize people in this community space because they're not a part of the traditional organization, but their interests align or maybe their passions align. And I think it's important to provide metrics for that in some way.
What does if there are any data or maybe futurists thinking about that intersection, What should we expect from that intersection? Will it grow? Why and how will it grow? What are your thoughts about that?
So there are some cost savings and purely economic rationales for why it'll grow. And in the 21st century, it's about globalizing knowledge work. So for instance, right now I can hire an accountant anywhere, anyone, anywhere in the world. And there's a system of ratings and reviews and legal contracts all set up. And it becomes easier almost to work with them than work with someone. For me, I live in San Francisco, so someone else in San Francisco, right?
Which is interesting, yeah.
So basically, because of that, the cost of living is becoming a decision-making factor in non-manufacturing and non-industrial businesses, which is probably the largest disruptive force that's going underreported. Much more so than automation, because it's much easier to do. So imagine if every aspect of your business could be outsourced, right? So like, what do you keep here? Because the cost of living is higher. So because of that, I think, this interstitial community space is going to grow a lot for inherent supply-demand reasons. It'll grow because businesses are trying to differentiate themselves from the market. So imagine there's a clothing company called Beta Brand that all of their designs are crowdsourced, and it's crowdfunded as well, which basically means that the company never takes a loss on a product because they pre-sell everything, which is traditionally we work with an inverted product cycle where businesses pay for something before they know if it's profitable or not. So there's new business models that rely on an increased size of that community space. There's a lot of supply and demand rationales for it. And also, if you're if you make rugs, right? If you make anything, if you make shoes, building that community is what differentiates you from commoditization, where you're competing just on price alone.
Cool. The question I've really been eager to ask you is, what will the job of the futurist look like in 10 years?
So I think there's a lot more people doing futures work.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and one thing that I like about the Institute is we don't sit still, and we don't sit on our haunches. And it would be really easy to do that and say that we can just talk about disruptions and all of these things. I like to give things away. I like to give organizations insights that previously a year ago I would have charged them for a project. And that prompts us to constantly move forward. And I think the nature of being a successful futurist in the future will be predicated upon that. That today we just talk about these disruptions, these new technologies that are changing things. That's not enough.
No.
And that's not enough. I think that's enough. That was enough middle of last year, and it's not enough anymore.
So what do we need else?
So I think in a really intimate way, we need to understand how today becomes tomorrow, which is how do organizations change, which is organizational psychology, it's business, it's economics, it's politics, it's sociology, it's anthropology, it's all of these things. And we need to understand, we need to continue to improve our capacity to help businesses navigate this space, which I think the Institute has been doing a great job of, because we understand, okay, we have this process called foresight to insight to action, which is, foresight is just what is the changing world, which that's all free online, all of these disruptions, right? The insight part is what is the significance for your organization, not only your industry, but your organization and its competitive place in the industry.
Yeah.
And then the action is what can you do about it. So the insight and the action are more important, and that's a much harder thing that I think very few people who do futures work do now, or can do, because they don't really understand the needs of organizations. But then before foresight is the skill that I mentioned earlier, which is vision, which is really helping organizations take a step back, because you can't just jump into talking about disruptions. Like, the more you study history, the more you understand what's going on now. Yeah. Because it's just crazy, right? Like for instance, one thing I like to include at the beginning of presentations, it's kind of kitschy. which is the history of how people have woken up. And originally people woke up just with the sun, right? Which meant that we either had to be outdoors or be in a place that had roofs that had holes in them, or we had roosters or some other animal that would wake us up. But that, of course, that was before electric lighting and candles and all of these things. So that wasn't a problem back then. How do people wake up?
Yeah.
Eventually, though, because of denser urban design, up through from the Middle Ages onward, and I'm sure before that, we had human beings who had the job professionally of waking people up.
Sure.
And it's because in the city, you wouldn't be able to have roosters everywhere, right? Or barn animals that wake you up. And also we had roofs that didn't have holes in them, right? And so because of that, we actually had people with really long sticks who built relationships with other people. And they were paid to knock on people's windows at specific times, right? And it's a relationship-oriented business because people would have to trust that you would wake them up, right? And you'd have a route. But of course, when buildings get too tall, that no longer becomes possible. And also the cost of human labor was going up, and because of this, I guess, the second wave of automation, bringing automation into the household, we got pieces of hardware. So suddenly what didn't become a problem, before human alarm clocks, became a problem that we solved with human labor, that we eventually solved with hardware, which were these physical pieces of hardware. And then, of course, we have smartphones now. So a piece of hardware became a piece of software. And the big difference, of course, is the cost of acquisition. That software is essentially free to distribute, therefore it's much cheaper. And now there are actually all of these services that sit on top of that software process. One of them, I don't know if it's still around, was a startup called Wakey that basically... Wakey. Yeah, that's coordinated phone calls between different people all around the world. So that instead of being woken up every morning by your software with the same tone, you'd get a phone call from someone in Singapore or Venezuela with a personalized wake up. So something that wasn't a problem, throughout human history, for the vast majority of human history, became a problem that we solved with human labor, right? Became a problem that we solved with hardware, making a lot of jobs obsolete. Became a problem that we solved with software. Became a problem that we solved with it's not a problem, it's now something value added because waking up is free, right? 95% of all jobs that have ever existed have been automated away. And it takes, you really have to think about that, right? Because we really are in this transitional moment, Will we have restaurants in 30 years? Like, what will the world look like? There's really no way to tell, but I think helping businesses successfully navigate the next 5 years means that, they will be profitable and successful for at least that long. And there is no far future. No. So, but I think most futurists in general, they only talk about the disruptions, and they can't help organizations understand the insights or the action or help them practice the vision.
Good point. So to wrap it up, Alex, what do you look into? So what's your next thing as a futurist? Might not be there yet, but what are your next theme or?
Yeah, for me personally, I'm very interested in the social contract and cultural values. There are a lot of talks about guaranteed basic income and lots of different strategies for reacting to automation. And I think both from a governmental perspective, from an industry perspective, from a foundational and nonprofit perspective, and I think it's really important. It's more important than ever. America is a dream-based economy. It's always been a dream-based economy. People moved to this country. My ancestors came to this country, that country, because they wanted a better life, right? And they thought, okay, I might work hard and for my entire life, and I might, die in poverty or relative poverty, but my children will have opportunities, right? And this has been the glue that's kept America together. And it's not that it's obsolete. It's quite the opposite. But the question is, we need to look at it again, because those values are why America exists. And every country has its own unspoken social contract. Sure. And when there's a wave of automation, so just hypothetical situation. Imagine 2 years from now, software comes out online that is a perfect therapist. And I don't think this will happen, but let's just imagine that it does. And that it makes all professional therapists obsolete. Yeah. These are people who have gone to school for a long time, who identify their position in society based on their education and their contribution to helping people, and who want to help people using their skill set. And suddenly they're no longer employable, right? Like what happens, there would be a huge amount of philosophical and ethical discussions that historically we haven't had. And I think we need to start tying discussions about meaning and purpose, both for organizations and for governments and society, into discussions about disruptions, because that will dictate what does and does not succeed, right? So for instance, if there are people in the US who believe in strict individualism and that there's no role for government in their lives, basically they can only fall back on blaming people if being an individual and pursuing that course of individualism is no longer profitable, right? Sure. So I think that contributes in large to the rise in nationalism globally, questions about meaning and purpose. And I think it'll be a prevailing undercurrent that we need to start considering.
That's a very good point. Alex, it's been a pleasure. Hope you're enjoying the rest of your stay in Copenhagen. Have a nice flight back.
Thank you.
And I can encourage everyone to step by Palo Alto and visit the Institute for the Future. I've been there. It was a pleasure. So that's all for now.
Yeah, and you can people can also email me however they want to get in contact with me.
We're gonna make sure that your contact information is available. So thank you for now.
Thank you. Yep.
Nobody's safe anymore. Had to wake you niggas up, I couldn't wait anymore. Got so much shit on my mind, couldn't think anymore. I swear when this album drop, they gon' hate me some more. You gon' see red everywhere, like a steak when it's raw. Fuck around and call me M.A. Shakur. I'ma take them to war. Top of the hill, that's me waving that sword. Couldn't wait to be on. Big rappers hate to be born. Speaking of birth, I just wanna thank my mother for having me after she had my brother. All that pain and that suffer, she ain't just half as natural. The doctors, they had to cut her. C-section, but what a blessing. Who would've guessed?